The cabin was buzzing with the usual shuffle of boarding passengers, the sound of carry-ons dragging across the narrow aisle, and the faint hum of engines preparing for flight. Yet in the middle of this ordinary routine, something extraordinary and deeply unsettling was about to unfold. All eyes turned when Harry Wilson, a man in a tailored suit with a kind of arrogance that made him loud without even raising his voice, pointed his finger toward the cockpit. His words cut through the air like a blade. "I'm not about to get on a plane being flown by a cripple." He scoffed, his tone dripping with contempt. Murmurs rose among the passengers, uneasy and confused. Some gasped. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to react to such open cruelty. The target of that venom, James Carter, sat poised in his wheelchair at the cockpit entrance. He was a man who carried not just the crisp uniform of a senior pilot, but also the weight of 2 decades in the skies. More than 15,000 hours guiding aircraft safely through storms and silence alike. A tragic car accident years earlier had taken the strength of his legs, but not the power of his hands, his mind, or his unshakable dedication to the craft. James did not rise to the insult because he could not, but even if he could, he would not. He met Harry's disdain with the same steady calm that had kept countless passengers alive through turbulence and lightning. A quiet smile, measured, almost practiced, spread across his face. This was not the first time prejudice tried to ground him, and it would not be the last. Around them, the tension thickened. A young mother whispered words of reassurance to her child, as though to shield him from the ugliness of the moment. An older man muttered something about shame, and yet, James offered no defense, no counterattack. His silence spoke louder than outrage ever could. To him, the skies had always been his answer, and his professionalism, his proof. He guided his chair forward, eyes on the task ahead, and prepared for takeoff. In the far rows, someone else had been watching with unusual intensity. Ethan Monroe, seated quietly by the window, did not miss a single word or movement. His gaze lingered not only on Harry's sneer, but also on James's quiet dignity. He had seen prejudice before, in different forms, in different rooms, but the sting of it always landed the same. Ethan said nothing then, but the moment imprinted itself on his mind with the clarity of a scar. As the plane ascended, the unease of the boarding faded into the usual rhythm of flight. James's voice over the intercom was smooth, precise, the voice of someone who had navigated both storms in the skew and storms within himself. Passengers settled into books, movies, and small talk. Yet the earlier exchange clung faintly to the air like smoke after a fire. Harry Wilson, now reclining smugly in his seat, muttered just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Lucky we didn't crash before takeoff." He laughed, oblivious to the looks of disapproval surrounding him. To him, James was just another man to mock and dismiss. But to others, seeds of unease and respect began to grow unease for the cruelty so casually displayed. Respect for the composure that had met it. James, of course, heard none of those whispers. He was in the cockpit, his mind focused, his body steady, proving once again that what defined him was not the chair beneath him, but the sky above. What Harry failed to see and what Ethan silently understood was that strength was not always loud or visible. Sometimes it sat quietly, enduring insult after insult, and still choosing to rise above. The landing hours later was flawless, smooth as silk on a calm lake, a quiet reminder that skill cannot be diminished by the ignorance of others. That day, James Carter did more than fly a plane. He carried with him the truth that dignity outshines cruelty, even when no one stands to defend you. And in that cabin, though many passengers might forget by the time they picked up their luggage, one man did not. Ethan Monroe walked off that plane knowing he had witnessed something larger than a flight. It was a test of humanity, and not everyone had passed. If you believe in stories where justice finds its way, where dignity rises above hate, and where true worth is revealed in the quietest of moments, stay with us until the end. This is Heart Story, and what comes next will not only surprise you, It might just change the way you see people forever. Under the golden lights of the city evening, James Carter slipped quietly out of the airport. The day had already tested his patience, but he bore it with the same calm that had carried him through 20 years of turbulence. He did not linger, did not look back. The passengers would go on with their lives, and so would he. Somewhere across the terminal, Harry Wilson strutted with satisfaction painted across his face. He muttered to anyone within earshot that they were fortunate the plane had landed at all, that he had risked his life with a man in a wheelchair behind the controls. His arrogance followed him like a shadow, feeding on his own ignorance. To Harry, the flight was nothing more than another excuse to mock. To James, it had simply been another job well done. That night, the scene shifted from airport gates to the grand interior of a luxury hotel where one of the most competitive corporate interviews in the country was about to take place. The ballroom had been converted into a formal dining hall for the evening, the air heavy with the scent of polished oak and ambition. At the head of the long table sat Lewis Carter, CEO of a Fortune 500 company. With the composure of a man who had built an empire from persistence, Lewis was preparing to evaluate two finalists for the coveted position of Chief Financial Officer. Harry Wilson entered first, radiating the confidence of someone who believed opportunity bent naturally in his direction. His suit was pressed, his tie sharp, his grin rehearsed. He shook hands too firmly, spoke too loudly, carried himself as if he were already the chosen man. He glanced around the room, mentally calculating the value of every painting on the wall, every piece of silver on the table, and concluded this was where he belonged. Moments later, the second candidate arrived. Ethan Monroe carried no such bravado. His presence was quiet, almost unassuming, but the sincerity in his eyes gave him a weight Harry lacked. Ethan was younger, openly gay, and had spent years working in nonprofit organizations that fought poverty and offered aid to marginalized communities. He had not come with a trail of exaggerated accomplishments, but with stories of service, of work that changed lives at the cost of his own comfort. Lewis studied him closely, sensing a different kind of strength at the table. It was only when their eyes locked across the linen and silver that recognition dawned. Harry stiffened, his arrogant composure cracking for the first time. Ethan's memory flashed back to the cabin that morning, to the venom of Harry's words against the pilot, to the composure of James Carter enduring them. Ethan had sat in silence then, but silence no longer seemed possible. Here, the very man who had spat contempt at another's dignity was presenting himself as a candidate for one of the most powerful financial roles in the company. The tension in the room thickened like a storm cloud. Harry tried to brush it off with a practiced smirk, but the weight of shared memory hung between them. Ethan said nothing yet, though his gaze carried the unspoken reminder that some actions are not so easily forgotten. Harry's arrogance only swelled in response, convinced that his polished resume and connections would overshadow anything else. But Lewis, watching quietly, noticed the subtle sparks between his two candidates. It was not competition alone, but something deeper bound them in a thread of tension that demanded unraveling. The evening stretched on, the conversation moving toward business or strategies, leadership philosophies, and visions for the company's future. Harry seized every question like a performance stage, his words rehearsed, his gestures exaggerated, his voice loud enough to command attention. He wanted to dominate the room, to drown Ethan out before he even began. But Ethan, though quieter, carried something Harry could never manufacture. He spoke with a measured tone, patient and steady, as though the weight of lived experience gave him a confidence that required no theatrics. The dinner carried an undercurrent of unease, one that only Ethan seemed to fully grasp. He knew what Harry was capable of when no spotlight was shining on him. He had seen the man's cruelty without provocation, his disdain for someone whose only flaw was to live with dignity from a wheelchair. Tonight, that memory lived at the edge of every word, and though Ethan did not speak of it yet, he carried with him the truth, ready to let it surface when the moment demanded. Outside the grand windows, the city lights shimmered across the skyline. Inside, a battle of character was unfolding, invisible to most, but impossible to stop. For all his arrogance, Harry had not realized that the real test of the evening had already begun. He believed the interview was about money and numbers, about control and image. Ethan understood differently. He knew it was about the soul of leadership, about whether a company built on resilience and legacy could be entrusted to someone who degraded others. By the end of the night, Lewis Carter would not only evaluate qualifications, but witness the collision of truth and deception, dignity and arrogance. And Ethan Monroe, who had walked silently off a plane just hours before, was now holding the memory of that flight like a compass, guiding him toward what had to be said. In rooms like this, true education is not written on diplomas or measured in net worth. It is revealed in how a person values the humanity of another. And while Harry believed he had mastered the art of success, he had already failed the lesson that mattered most. The next evening unfolded inside the same hall, but the air was sharper, tense with the kind of silence that precedes revelation. Harry Wilson leaned forward in his chair, a gleam of practiced charm lighting his face as he spoke in long, elaborate sentences. He presented himself as a self-made success story, layering numbers and titles, painting a portrait of a man destined to command power. His voice never faltered. His confidence never paused. But beneath the rhythm of his speech, there was hollowness. He was selling an image, not a truth, and he believed no one could tell the difference. Ethan Monroe listened patiently, hands folded on the table, his composure a striking contrast to Harry's restless bravado. When his turn came, he did not begin with balance sheets or clever slogans. He began with memory. His words carried the weight of a son watching his father's life fracture after a terrible accident left him paralyzed. He spoke of hospital visits, of endless nights of worry, of a home that suddenly became a battlefield against despair. But then he spoke of the day hope returned, when the charitable foundation created by Lewis Carter's company helped his family transform their small house into a place where his father could live with dignity again. A ramp replaced stairs, medical equipment replaced makeshift tools, and for the first time in years, his father felt seen rather than discarded. Ethan's tone was not theatrical. It was steady, sincere, filled with a quiet conviction that came not from ambition, but from lived reality. He explained how that act of compassion had shaped him, how it drove him to dedicate his own career to nonprofit work, to serve those the world tried to forget. It is not only skill or ambition that keeps a company alive, he said, his gaze locked with Lewis's. It is the heart to remember why it exists in the first place. Compassion and resilience are not weaknesses. They are the foundations of endurance. Harry shifted uncomfortably, sensing the ground tilt beneath him. Desperate, he interrupted with a forced laugh, claiming he too had a brother in a wheelchair. A story he spun with shallow details and mismatched fragments. But the falsehood clung to his words like smoke to fire, impossible to disguise. The room grew heavy with skepticism. Where Ethan's story resonated with raw truth, Harry's stumbled with the cracks of invention. Lewis Carter said little, but his eyes lingered on Ethan with the unmistakable recognition of someone hearing his own company's purpose echoed back to him. Harry, meanwhile, tried to regain footing, returning to spreadsheets and forecasts, as if numbers could wash away the stench of dishonesty. Yet the more he spoke, the more apparent his emptiness became. His ambition was self-serving, while Ethan's ambition was rooted in service. It was then that the doors opened quietly, and a familiar figure wheeled into the room. James Carter entered with the calm presence that came from years of command in the skies. Dressed in his uniform, he was no longer the silent pilot enduring insult, but a man stepping into the light of his own story. Conversation ceased as recognition swept across the table. Ethan's eyes widened, startled by the sudden convergence of worlds. While Harry's face drained of color, James scanned the room before his gaze settled on Harry Wilson. The memory was sharp in his mind, the sting of the word invalid, the sneer about being a diversity hire, the cruel prediction that the plane would crash before takeoff. He had heard them all that morning, and now the man who spoke them sat across from him, pretending at professionalism, vying for a role that demanded integrity. The atmosphere tightened, as though every guest could sense the collision of truth barreling toward them. Harry stammered, caught in the weight of recognition. Ethan sat silently, understanding that the story was no longer his to tell. It belonged to James now, the man who had borne the insult and risen above it. What began as a routine interview had turned into something larger, a stage where arrogance, dignity, and truth were about to clash in plain view. In that charged silence, the true measure of character revealed itself. Harry's resume, his arrogance, his claims, they all seemed paper-thin when confronted with the living testimony of a man who had endured more than he could ever imagine. Ethan's story and James's presence converged like two rivers meeting at a bend, carrying with them undeniable proof that the strength of a leader is not in what he claims, but in what he has lived and how he treats others. Moments like this remind us that truth has a way of finding its place. No matter how carefully arrogance tries to bury it, a lie can dress itself in confidence and polish. But honesty wears time like armor, and when the two finally collide, it is always the lived truth that stands unshaken. The meeting hall, once filled with the hum of cutlery and calculated small talk, fell into a silence so deep that even the faint clink of a glass sounded like thunder. James Carter sat calmly in his wheelchair, the polished wings on his uniform catching the glow of the chandelier. Across the table, Harry Wilson shifted in his chair, his hands trembling as if the weight of truth pressed down upon them. Every face turned toward James, waiting for the words that hung on the edge of the evening. James did not rush. His composure carried the same gravity that had steadied countless flights through storms. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, but it carried the precision of a man who had repeated these moments silently in his mind. He recalled every insult from that morning with chilling accuracy, the word invalid hurled like a stone, the sneer about being nothing more than a diversity hire, the cold prediction that the plane might crash before it ever left the ground. Each phrase was recited with a clarity that left no space for denial. The color drained from Harry's face. He attempted to interrupt, to dismiss the story as exaggeration, but James's steady voice drowned out his excuses. There was no anger in the pilot's tone, only the sharp blade of truth laid bare for all to see. Ethan Monroe, seated quietly but attentively, confirmed every detail with a firm nod. His eyes steady on Lewis Carter, the weight of corroboration sealed the account. The room, filled with executives and staff, became a court of witness, and Harry stood exposed at its center. Harry's defenses crumbled quickly. His earlier arrogance evaporated into stammered denials. He tried to smile, to weave his usual net of charm, but the room no longer bent to his performance. His words carried no substance, no resonance, only desperation. The veneer of confidence that had carried him through so many rooms before could not withstand the collision of testimony from both James and Ethan. He had walked into the evening believing numbers and bravado would be enough. Now, confronted with the truth, all he had left was silence. Lewis Carter rose slowly from his chair. The authority of a man who had built an empire radiated from him, but it was softened by the humanity in his gaze as he looked first at his brother, then at Ethan. "James," he said, his voice carrying through the hall, "is the reason this company's foundation exists. When the world tried to reduce him to less than what he is, he proved time and again that dignity and resilience are stronger than ignorance. He is not only my brother, he is my inspiration." The declaration hung in the air like a verdict. The executives around the table straightened, absorbing not just the decision, but the legacy it carried. Lewis then turned to Ethan, his eyes sharp but kind. And tonight, he continued, "You reminded us of that same truth. Leadership is not built on arrogance or empty boasts. It is built on compassion, on the courage to be honest when honesty costs you something, and on the willingness to see the worth in others." With that, the outcome was clear. Harry Wilson was no longer a candidate. His name, once printed on the evening's agenda, became irrelevant in the space of a single conversation. Lewis announced his disqualification without ceremony, but the weight of the decision rang louder than any gavel. Harry was left frozen in his chair, every path forward stripped away by his own actions. Ethan Monroe, meanwhile, sat stunned, not at the opportunity suddenly opening before him, but at the recognition that his truth had mattered. He had not tried to perform or to polish his story into something it wasn't. He had simply spoken from the life he had lived, and that honesty had become his greatest strength. The room slowly returned to motion, but the air carried a lesson that could not be shaken. Leadership, everyone realized, was not about power seized by force of ego. It was about power entrusted because of integrity. Harry had spoken as though cruelty was strength, but strength had revealed itself in the quiet endurance of James and the steady sincerity of Ethan. Moments like this carve deep reminders into those who witness them. Respect is not demanded through arrogance or bought with credentials. It is earned in how one treats others when there is nothing to gain. In business, as in life, the measure of a person is not their performance under praise, but their dignity under pressure. And on this night, the truth left no room for doubt. The night ended with the weight of resolution. Harry Wilson was escorted from the hall in silence, the echo of his disgrace following him like a shadow that could never be outrun. What he did not realize until he returned to the hotel lobby was that his ticket home had already been canceled. Lewis Carter himself had arranged it, a deliberate act of justice for the man who had mocked his brother and tried to poison a room with arrogance. The airline confirmed the cancellation with a shrug. To Harry, there would be no comfortable return, no victory to salvage. He was left stranded, humiliated, a reminder that contempt for others eventually finds its way back to the one who cast it. Inside the ballroom, however, a different kind of story was unfolding. Ethan Monroe sat stunned as Lewis Carter officially named him the next chief financial officer. The announcement was not just about a title or a salary, it was about a recognition of character, of values carried into a room where numbers often mattered more than people. Ethan's heart raced as he shook hands with executives, each congratulation a confirmation that integrity had prevailed over pretense. But the story did not end there. Weeks later, during a grand ceremony to introduce Ethan as CFO, James Carter once again rolled onto the stage, not as a silent witness this time, but as a voice of gratitude. He looked out over the crowd before turning his eyes toward Ethan, his expression softer than it had been in years of carrying quiet resilience. With emotion steady in his tone, James revealed something only a few had known. He had first seen Ethan Monroe not in a boardroom, not even on the flight where cruelty had unfolded, but at a Pride event years earlier. At that event, Ethan had stood quietly at the edge of a stage, not seeking attention, not waving banners, but making a donation so significant that it startled the organizers. Nearly every dollar he had saved at the time had been given to a shelter supporting young LGBT people cast out by their families. James remembered watching him from a distance, admiring the courage it took to give so much when he had so little. Recognizing a spirit that chose generosity over security, now in front of a packed hall, James shared that memory with the world. His voice carried not only pride but gratitude. "Ethan," he said, his words slow and steady, "you did not only save your father's dignity with your compassion, you carried forward to the same fight my brother and I began years ago, the fight for every person's right to live with dignity, no matter who they are or who they love. You proved that kindness is not weakness. It is the strongest legacy we can leave behind." The audience erupted in applause, not for wealth, not for power, but for a truth that rarely found such a stage. Ethan stood there humbled, his eyes glistening with quiet acknowledgement. He had not sought recognition, but recognition had found him. And in that moment, it was not about a title or position. It was about continuing a mission larger than himself. Lewis Carter closed the evening with words that bound the night together. This company, he declared, was not built to reward arrogance. It was built to honor resilience and justice. Ethan Monroe is not just our next CFO. He is our reminder that true leadership is measured not by how high you climb, but by how you lift others along the way. The lesson of the evening was etched into every heart that listened. Prejudice and arrogance might find temporary power, but they collapse when confronted by the quiet force of truth. Compassion, though often unseen, leaves echoes far louder and more lasting than cruelty ever could. As the applause faded and the cameras clicked, the story lingered like an open question to everyone watching on that stage and beyond it. When faced with the choice between arrogance and compassion, between contempt and dignity, which path would you choose if this story moved you? Share your thoughts below. Do you believe kindness still has the power to shape leadership in today's world? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to follow Heart Stories for more stories that remind us of the strength we carry when we stand for dignity, justice, and truth.